Okay, let's dive right into this explainer by tackling something we all know a little too well. We have absolutely all been there, right? You're lying awake at 2 a.m., the room is dead silent, but your mind is just racing at 100 miles an hour. You're replaying some mildly awkward conversation from like 3 years ago, or you're simulating a complete disaster scenario for a perfectly normal meeting you have next week. It is so exhausting. But look, right off the bat, we need to establish our core premise for today. Your brain isn't broken. Seriously, this isn't a personal failure, and you don't just lack discipline. As our source material reveals, your mind is simply stuck in a highly predictable, mechanical loop.
And I think this quote perfectly validates how painful overthinking actually is. At that point, it no longer feels like something you are doing, it feels like something that is happening to you. I mean, it always starts innocently enough, doesn't it? You just want to analyze a quick problem. But then, almost instantly, it crosses this invisible threshold. It stops being a deliberate choice and transforms into this overwhelming, automatic process that just sweeps you up. You literally become a hostage in your own head.
So here is our roadmap for escaping that loop. First, the overthinking trap. 2, why the brain won't stop. 3, how to break the loop. 4, managing nighttime overthinking. 5, lowering your mental baseline. And finally, number 6, thinking as a useful tool.
All right, jumping into section 1, the overthinking trap, recognizing the loop. To actually escape this trap, we first have to completely separate what overthinking is from what we traditionally consider thinking. Because, well, confusing the two is exactly how we get stuck in the first place. Overthinking is basically a self-reinforcing mechanical loop. When you look at it as a system, you realize it needs specific fuel to keep spinning. Your brain treats these unfinished thoughts as massive problems requiring urgent attention. It generates all this tension and then tries to resolve that tension with, you guessed it, more thinking, which just feeds the loop. It is literally like trying to put out a fire by throwing gasoline on it.
The absolutely crucial takeaway here is the contrast between these two modes. Intentional thinking, that is a clear direction and an endpoint. Like you need to buy a car, you compare the prices, you make your choice. Boom, the thinking stops. Overthinking, on the other hand, starts small, expands endlessly, and has absolutely zero clear conclusion. It gives you this sneaky illusion of progress because there's just so much mental movement happening, but actually, it's just maintaining a state of high tension without ever arriving at a destination.
Moving on to section 2, why the brain won't stop, the problem-solving engine.
So here is the surprising truth. Your brain doesn't actually want silence. Total silence is deeply uncomfortable for a brain that's basically addicted to problem solving. Think of it like a hyperactive boss that absolutely refuses to let you clock out. And since the brain doesn't objectively know what's actually important in the modern world, it relies on what we call false important signals. We're talking about things like high emotional intensity, endless repetition, extreme familiarity, or deep uncertainty. If a thought has those qualities, your brain slaps a massive red flag on it and calls it an urgent threat. It genuinely confuses the physical feeling of anxiety with actual, literal, physical danger. Which brings us directly to what's known as the certainty trap. Look, your brain absolutely hates ambiguity. It wants a 100% guarantee. So to fix that uncertainty, it starts obsessively generating endless future scenarios just trying to find one definitive answer. But here's the wild paradox. You can't predict the future, so every single new scenario you invent just introduces more variables. And that, paradoxically, creates even more uncertainty, feeding the loop even faster.
Okay, section 3, how to break the loop, injecting breakpoints.
Before we can even use these breakpoints, we really need to talk about the paradox of suppression. Have you ever wondered why screaming, "Stop thinking about this," inside your head actually makes it worse? It's because your brain doesn't distinguish between attention used for engaging with a thought and attention used for suppressing it. Attention is just attention. Forcing it to stop just gives it more fuel. So, instead of brute force, you gotta use gentle influence by deploying these 4 breakpoints. First, notice the initial engagement. Catch the thought early before it spirals out of control. Second, limit expansion. Don't add new interpretations or what-ifs. Just stop building. Third, separate the physical response. Look, just because your heart is racing doesn't mean the thought is actually important. And fourth, reduce repetition by actively choosing to withdraw your attention. You interrupt the thought by starving it of engagement, not by wrestling with it.
An incredibly powerful, totally practical way to do this in the moment is something called labeling the loop. When you catch yourself spiraling, mentally identify the process. Just say to yourself, hey, this is just simulation, or this is just overthinking.
By simply putting a name to the mechanical process happening in your head, you create instant distance from the actual content of the scary thought. You step back from being a panicked participant to being an observer watching a machine run.
Which leads us to Section 4, Managing Nighttime Overthinking, Night Mode.
We absolutely must address the most universal pain point of all. Why on earth does this entire chaotic process seem to get exponentially worse the exact second your head hits the pillow? Well, the source material makes it very clear. Your brain isn't fundamentally changing its structure at 10 p.m. What changes is your environment, specifically the sudden total removal of external anchors.
Think about it. During the day, you have tasks, you have conversations, you're physically moving around. All of these things act as anchors that naturally distribute your attention. But at night, you enter what's called the silence amplification effect. With literally zero external competition for your attention, the internal volume of your thoughts just gets cranked up to a 10. The thoughts aren't actually new, and they aren't even worse. They are just suddenly the only thing in the room.
So, what's the takeaway here? How do we combat this? Well, you shouldn't try to force perfect silence in your bedroom or in your head. That backfires. Instead, try these nighttime interventions. Add some low-level ambient sound, like a fan or white noise, just to give your brain a neutral external anchor to latch onto. Focus lightly on your breathing. Now, if you are truly trapped in a loop, physically get out of bed. You have to break the association between your mattress and anxiety. And most importantly, remove that awful monitor-like pressure of forcing yourself to sleep. Just focus on resting your body and take the pressure off your mind.
All right, Section 5, Lowering Your Mental Baseline.
Nighttime fixes are great, for sure, but to truly escape the loop long-term, we really have to look at your daytime habits. There are a few main culprits inflating your overloaded mental state during the day, which inevitably spills over into your night. First, we've got constant dopamine hits from screen overstimulation. This literally conditions your brain to expect non-stop input. Then there's information overload. We consume so much fragmented media that it creates this massive backlog of unprocessed thoughts. It's literally like having 45 browser tabs open in your brain all day. Add in environmental clutter and chaos, and your brain never gets a single moment of neutral rest. To lower this baseline, you have to intentionally create pockets of low input during your day. Give your brain a chance to process that backlog before it's time for bed.
Finally, Section 6, Thinking as a Useful Tool, the Edge.
This right here brings us to a massive paradigm shift. The ultimate goal of this explainer is not to teach you how to achieve a completely silent, perfectly empty mind. That's totally impossible. The actual goal is reclaiming deep thinking as a directed, incredibly useful tool. Overthinking is reactive. It's circular, it's driven by fear, and it completely lacks boundaries. But deep thinking? That is your superpower. Deep thinking is intentional, it's structured, it leads directly to clarity, and most importantly, it operates within strict time limits. You think about a problem for, say, 20 minutes, you reach the absolute best conclusion you can with the data you currently have, and then you purposefully put the tool down.
I want to emphasize this so heavily as we start to wrap up. You are not broken. Please just let that sink in for a second. Your mind is not malfunctioning. It is simply a highly powerful engine that has been operating without limits for way too long. It doesn't need to be punished. It doesn't need to be suppressed. It just needs to be gently guided and given healthy boundaries, rather than being left entirely on autopilot.
So, what you should really take away from this explainer today is this final, incredibly empowering thought. The goal isn't to achieve an impossible perfect silence. The goal is to achieve control. You get to decide where your attention goes, which leaves us with a final thought to ponder as we go. What if the greatest tool you possess isn't meant to be turned off, but simply steered?